Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Ibrahim Osman Adam from the School of Business at the University for Development Studies. Today, I'll be talking about sampling in qualitative research. Sampling is a critical component that often determines the success of our research endeavors. Sampling, to many of us, might seem straightforward, but in qualitative research, it requires very thoughtful consideration beyond the simple question about how many participants one would need for a particular kind of study. The decision we make about sampling directly impacts the depth, the breadth, and ultimately the credibility of our findings. Throughout my several years of conducting qualitative studies on business and technology adoption in diverse contexts, I have learned that sampling decisions can be guided by our research questions. It can be guided by methodological approaches we use rather than by arbitrary numbers. In this presentation, I will cover various sampling strategies, how to determine appropriate sample sizes, the relationship between sampling and saturation, and also maybe some practical approaches that we can use that have worked well in my own research. I believe that when we have a strong sampling, it can lead to rich data, which in turn can lead to producing meaningful insights. Today, my goal is to equip you with practical knowledge that you can apply to your own research projects. Let's start with the fundamentals of sampling in qualitative research. At its core, sampling can easily be basically be explained as the process of selecting participants or data sources for our research. But as straightforward as that may sound, the decisions we make about who to include in our research, this has got very profound implications for our findings. Well, one of the most important points I want to emphasize today is that qualitative sampling is different from quantitative sampling approaches. I often see students trying to apply quantitative sampling logic to qualitative studies. It just doesn't work. For instance, in quantitative research, we typically are concerned with random selection and statistical representation. But in our qualitative work, our focus is on the depth of insight rather than statistical generalizability. I remember when I first started my research career, I was very preoccupied with getting large numbers of participants for different kinds of studies until one day a mentor helped me to understand that even when I have 10 information-rich interviews, that can be better, far more valuable than 50 superficial ones. So your sampling decisions directly impact the trustworthiness and transferability of your findings. If your sampling is poor, it can undermine even the most rigorous analysis you may want to conduct. In the past, I have also reviewed many manuscripts where interesting findings were ultimately questioned because of problematic sampling approaches. Looking at the graphic on the slide, it illustrates how we select a smaller group from a larger population, and that's what sampling is about. But you have to take notice that in qualitative research, we are not necessarily looking for a miniature version of the whole data or the whole population. Instead, we are strategically just selecting participants who we think that they can provide the richest insights we are looking for, the richest insights into our research questions. So throughout this presentation, I'll be sharing not just the theoretical foundations of qualitative sampling, but I will also present practical strategies that I have developed, that I have learned over the years. My goal here is to help you make sampling decisions that can strengthen rather than weaken your research. Now, let's examine the defining characteristics that make qualitative sampling very different from other research approaches. First and foremost, qualitative sampling is very purposeful. It's purposeful rather than random. It's never random. In my research on technology adoption among small businesses, deliberately, if I'm looking for owners with different experiences, probably I would look at early adopters of technology, maybe some from the late adopters and then some from the resistors, rather than randomly selecting participants. This purposeful approach will ensure that I capture diverse perspectives on the phenomena I am investigating. In qualitative research, we typically work with very small sample sizes. This often may surprise some students who are very much accustomed to quantitative approaches where larger numbers equate to greater validity. But our focus in qualitative research is on the depth and not the breadth. I in the past have published studies with as few as maybe 6 to 8 participants in terms of qualitative study, when those individuals are just providing exceptionally rich insights. You see, the emergent design component is also very crucial. The emergent design component is also very crucial. This is because our sampling often evolves as the study is progressing. Rarely will you find finalization about our entire sample at the outset. We cannot determine our sample at the outset. Instead, what we do is we begin with initial participants that we have purposefully selected, and then we make decisions about who to include and next based on the what? On the emerging findings. Okay, so when we are dealing with qualitative sampling, one of our focus is squarely on information richness. Squarely on information richness. We are seeking participants who can provide detailed, nuanced insights about our research questions. So, for instance, one information-rich interview can yield more valuable data than maybe 10 superficial ones. And it is in this regard that I keep asking myself, who can offer most illuminating perspective on a particular phenomenon I'm investigating? And then I concentrate on that. So with qualitative research, we are seeking deeper understanding of phenomena rather than what? Surface level descriptions. And this is what we usually would refer to as the depth. This depth orientation is important because it influences who we select and how we interact with them. And then finally, our sample size is determined by what? By saturation, not by statistical power calculations. We will continue sampling until we stop hearing new information. And that's when we say we have reached saturation. This is why it is difficult to precisely state sample sizes at the beginning of a study. In qualitative research, we are not able to determine the sample sizes. We purposefully select and we interview, we engage with the participants as we go on until we reach a point of saturation. The illustration on the right side shows how we strategically select specific participants from the larger population. And we do that based on their ability to inform our research questions. So it is important that we take this into consideration. Now, let's look at 4 key sampling strategies. And these 4 key sampling strategies are those that I have found most valuable in qualitative research. The diagram basically shows this as building blocks. And I think it's quite appropriate because they often work together rather than in isolation. So starting with purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is our foundational approach when it comes to what? Qualitative research. With purposive sampling, we are deliberately selecting participants based on specific criteria. Then we also have snowball sampling, which builds on this foundation. After identifying initial participants, we ask them to refer others who meet our criteria. And this is very valuable when studying hard to reach populations. Okay. Then the third strategy is maximum variation sampling. And maximum variation sampling involves deliberately selecting participants to represent diverse perspectives or experiences. Then finally, we have theoretical sampling. Theoretical sampling is closely tied to grounded theory methodology. Here, what we do is we select participants based on the emerging concepts and theoretical insights as the study is progressing. And this is highly iterative. It is iterative because we don't wait until we finish collecting the data. When we collect any data, we conduct analysis to see what insights are being drawn and how theoretical insights can be provided. Okay. Now, the key in all of this is selecting the strategy or combining a number of strategies. And that's the best you choose will be the one that align very well with your research questions and methodological approach. Now, let's take them one after the other and delve into it much more deeper. So now that we are getting into specific strategies, starting with what's probably the most common approach, which is purposive sampling. Purposive sampling is exactly as it sounds like. What we are basically doing here is we are deliberately selecting participants based on specific criteria that align with our research goals. So basically what it means is that we are just going to do a handpick participant who can best help us answer our research questions. A concrete example may be, say, you are researching the experiences of, say, first generation university students. Instead of randomly sampling from the student body, you can specifically seek out students who are the first in their families to attend college or the first in their families to attend university. This is deliberate, and this deliberate selection is the essence of what? Purposive sampling. When we're dealing with purposive sampling, the key here is that the participants are chosen specifically for their ability to provide insight on our research question. These are usually people who have lived the experiences we are studying or have knowledge about the phenomena we are trying to explore. One thing that trips up many new researchers is the need for clear justification of your selection criteria. So maybe your supervisor may want to know exactly why you chose this specific participants or you chose some specific participants. In that case, it is not enough for you to say because they were available. No, you can't do that. Or because they volunteered. You need to be able to articulate how their characteristics, their unique characteristics align with your research purpose. So in your research method section, you will need to be very transparent about questions like that. Questions like why these participants, what makes them appropriate for your study? How do they connect to your theoretical framework? All these are very, very important. Now, the next one I want us to discuss is snowball or chain sampling. Snowball sampling sometimes is referred to as chain sampling, sometimes referred to as referral sampling. It's probably one of the most intuitive approaches. I say it's one of the most intuitive approaches because it mimics how we naturally connect with people in our social networks. Now, let's explain how it works. Snowball sampling works. Usually with snowball sampling, you start with, say, one or few participants who meet your criteria. You see, after interviewing them, you ask if they know others who might be eligible for your study. Those participants will then refer you to others, and so on and so forth. Like a snowball rolling down a hill. That your sample grows larger as it moves along. So snowball sampling is especially valuable when you are working with hard-to-reach populations. Your participants are difficult to reach. So the best way to reach them will be to use referrals. Okay. Then the next one I want us to look at is maximum variation sampling. Maximum variation sampling is a particularly powerful approach. Now, the core idea with maximum variation sampling is that we are deliberately selecting diverse cases. And these diverse cases represent a wide range of experiences or characteristics that are related to the phenomena we are looking at. So if you look at it carefully, it might seem a bit counterintuitive at first, because why would you want to pick participants who are very different from each other? It's because of the heterogeneous nature of the population. So it works like this. When you find common patterns that emerge across these varied cases, those patterns are particularly meaningful and robust. So you also have to think about it this way. If people with different backgrounds or circumstances are reporting similar experiences, then it tells you that something significant about that particular phenomena is happening. Okay. Now, this particular approach is also it also helps in significantly strengthening the transferability of your findings. Transferability in qualitative research is all about how applicable your findings can be or might be to other contexts. So when you are already included, when you have already included, say, diverse contexts in your sample, it means that it will be easier for you to make the case that your findings have broader relevance because you have already included diverse categories. Okay. Then we have theoretical sampling. Let's talk about theoretical sampling. And theoretical sampling is more dynamic and evolving than what we have discussed so far. In terms of theoretical sampling, fundamentally, it is driven by the emerging theory during your data analysis. It is one of those beautiful features of qualitative research where the boundaries between the data collection and the analysis become so blurred. And that is why in such a situation, we often will say that the process is what? Iterative. So you go back and forth when you are collecting data, you are analyzing alongside. Let's see how it works in practice. You start collecting some initial data, perhaps through, say, interviews or observations. Then what you do is very important. You begin analyzing that data right away. So you collect the data for a particular day, you analyze right away. Based on what you have found, you make decisions about what additional data you need to collect and from whom. It is truly very iterative. And it is iterative because you collect data, analyze it, and then you decide what data to collect next. And then you repeat the process. So this way, I honestly would like to think of it as letting the data guide you to your next participant. That's what you do when you are using theoretical sampling, rather than deciding everyone at the beginning. Okay. So usually theoretical sampling is used with grounded theory approaches. Now, apart from these four, I want us to look at additional sampling approaches. So let's talk about, say, convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is a strategy that often gets a bad reputation in research methods fora because it has its disadvantages. So if you look at it as the name suggests, convenience sampling basically involves selecting participants who are easily accessible to you as the researcher. This might be students in your department, people at your workplace, or even members of your organization. But you see, the advantage with this is that it's extremely time and resource efficient because you don't have to struggle. Everything is based on convenience. When you are working with limited funding or maybe with limited deadlines, let's be honest, most of us, most of the time, convenience sampling is what would make our project feasible. So you rely on it. Okay, but it has got its potential limitations. Because of its convenience nature, you may miss important perspectives. Then we also have another approach, extreme or deviant case sampling. This strategy basically flips conventional wisdom on its head. Basically, what it does is that when we are using this approach, we are deliberately seeking out the unusual or exceptional cases rather than the typical ones. So with extreme case sampling, what basically we are doing is we are specifically focusing on individuals or situations that are unusual, situations that are what? Exceptional, or situations that represent the edges of our phenomenon we are looking at. So this might be outstanding successes, especially, and it may also involve maybe notable failures. So maybe a particular organization has done so well, we can consider that, or maybe there's a notable failure, we can consider that, or just highly unusual manifestation of what we are stating. Unusual scenarios can also fit into this. And the question is, why would we want to study things that are outliers? We want to do that because they often eliminate the boundaries and the possibilities of the phenomena in possibly ways that the typical cases cannot. So when we are looking at the extreme or deviant case sampling, it's like studying extreme issues, okay? And those ones can reveal important insights about typical situations. Then we also have criterion sampling. And this one is straightforward, but very powerful. It is powerful because many of you might find, and because of its powerful nature, some of you may find it very useful for your studies. In this particular kind of sampling, What you do is you select all cases that meet some predetermined criteria. That predetermined criteria is of importance to you. So it is a systematic way of ensuring that every participant in your study satisfies specific conditions. The moment they satisfy those specific conditions that are crucial to your research, then you pick them. So in applying criterion sampling, the first step is deciding exactly what your criteria is. For example, if you are studying the experience of, say, first generation university students who have successfully graduated, your criteria may be participants must have completed a degree and must be maybe the first in their immediate family to attend university. You see, with this particular type of sampling, what is crucial here is that you are trying to establish clear standards before you begin recruiting your participants. And that is the criteria. They are not flexible guidelines. They are specific requirements that participants must meet to be included in your study. If they don't meet it, you leave them out of your study. So with this particular approach, I mean, criterion sampling is particularly useful for quality assurance in your research, because when every participant meets the same basic criteria, you can be confident that your findings will truly relate to the phenomenon you are studying. And it will help you eliminate cases that might introduce a biasness or confounding factors or irrelevant perspectives in your research. The next one I want us to look at is critical case sampling. And this one is focused, is the approach, it's an approach that can make your qualitative research particularly a bit more persuasive. This is because with critical case sampling, it involves focusing on cases that make a point dramatically or are specific, or are especially important for the phenomenon you are studying. These are cases that offer particularly compelling evidence or insights about your research question. Look, the idea behind critical case sampling is that, for example, if I say something like, if something happens here, then it will happen anywhere. It means it is critical. Or sometimes you can even look at it in the opposite. If it doesn't happen here, it cannot happen anywhere. What we are basically doing here is that we are looking for cases that have strategic importance in relation to your research problem. So you can also think about it this way. When we are dealing with critical cases, the critical cases can be seen as those that are especially information rich and can demonstrate a particular point with special clarity. They are persuasive, they are precise because of their strategic significance. Okay, then next thing I want us to look at is, I want us to tackle one of the most common questions I get sometimes from students who are new to qualitative research. And the question is, how many participants do I need for my study? You see, the first thing to understand is that there are no fixed rules for the correct sample size in qualitative research. It's very different because qualitative research is very different from quantitative studies where power analysis can give you specific numbers. If you are coming from a quantitative background, look, you see, this ambiguity can feel uncomfortable at first because your sample size should fundamentally be guided by your research question and methodology. And I often will say this, different approaches have different norms. So for instance, if someone is doing a phenomenological study, what might work well with the person might be 6 to 10 participants. Whereas maybe if someone is doing grounded theory, he might need 20 to 30 to be able to reach saturation. There are practical factors that can influence the sample size decisions we make. Now, I want us to look at some of these factors. The first one I want us to consider is the study purpose. What is the purpose of your study? Are you trying to deeply understand a specific theme or experience, or are you developing a broader theory? More complex research questions may often require some participants to address adequately. Are you getting it? Then the next thing, so your study purpose is very important. Your available resources also very important. The time constraints are also very important. And most importantly, you have to consider the depth of your engagement with each participant. How long are you going to spend with the participant? If you are conducting multiple in-depth interviews with each person over time, you may need fewer participants than if you are doing single or brief interviews. I hope you understand that. When you do this, it can lead you into what we refer to as saturation. And saturation is a concept that's very fundamental to what qualitative sampling. Saturation is essentially or basically how we know when to stop collecting data because we have gotten enough or no new insights are being provided. There are actually several different types of saturation that are important to understand. We can have what we refer to as data saturation, when no new insights or themes are emerging. We can also have theoretical saturation. And theoretical saturation is the original concept from grounded theory. And basically, that one refers to the point when no new theoretical insights are being created. When we reach saturation, it is a signal, it's an appropriate signal that our sample size has been reached. So in qualitative research, we cannot predetermine our sample size until we reach the point of saturation. Now that we have covered various sampling strategies, I want us to connect them to specific qualitative methodologies. It's helpful. It will be helpful for us because as researchers, our methodology should guide our sampling decisions. So if you look at this particular slide, I have listed a number of approaches and the typical sampling strategies that will apply to them. For many of my students who are conducting a qualitative study as part of their master's or as part of their PhD, the case study approach may be the most profound. And with that, the most appropriate sampling strategy you need to use will be what? Unique, critical, or revelatory cases. Now, I want us to wrap up by discussing something very crucial: the ethical dimensions of sampling. These considerations we're going to look at should be at the forefront of your research design process. It should never be an afterthought. The first one is avoiding coercion in recruitment of participants. As researchers, we need to be vigilant about avoiding coercion in recruitment. Look, you see, given the power dynamics which are inherent in research, there's the potential that some potential participants may feel pressured to participate, especially if there's a pre-existing relationship. And I have seen this happening with maybe staff of a faculty recruiting their own students as part of their study. What we also have to ensure is that there is informed consent. It's very fundamental. Also, when working with vulnerable populations, additional protections may be what? May be necessary. You see, there's also the need for us to manage power dynamics. And managing power dynamics is something we don't talk about enough because as researchers, we often have educational, institutional, and social power. And this power, our participants don't have it. And it can affect who agrees to participate and what they feel about what we are doing. There's also an ethical obligation to ensure that our participants represent diverse perspectives in our research. And then finally, acknowledging excluded voices as part of our limitation section is also very important. No study can include everyone, but we have an ethical responsibility to be transparent about whose perspectives are not represented in our research and how that might affect our findings. It's very important that we state that as a limitation. Now, for our final topic for today, I want us to discuss how to effectively document your sampling decisions. It's critical not only for the credibility of your research, but it also will help you and help others to build on your work. So first and foremost, you have to be completely transparent about your selection criteria. Your readers need to understand exactly why certain participants were included and others were excluded. You see, apart from that, reflexivity is very important. Reflexivity is important, and this involves acknowledging how your own position, how your own background, and how your relationships might have influenced who participated in your your study. So indicating that is also very important. You also have to indicate clearly in your method section. You have to include a description, a detailed description of how the participants were recruited. You have to document it. You have to take the readers through each step, how the potential participants were identified, how they were contacted, what they were told about the study, and how the final sample was determined. It's very important. Also, every sampling approach has limitations, and acknowledging them can strengthen your work. So you have to acknowledge them. And then finally, you have to maintain a trail, an audit trail of your sampling decisions throughout your research process. You can do this by keeping records of how and why you made sampling choices, especially if your approach evolve during the study. Now, when we are dealing with sampling, it comes with quite a number of challenges. It comes with a number of challenges. For instance, access to participants is often often the major hurdle. You may have designed the perfect sampling strategy, but if you can't actually reach your intended participants, it won't work. So often two effective solutions are utilizing gatekeepers and maybe snowball sampling. When I say gatekeepers, I mean individuals who can facilitate access to communities or the organizations you want to look at. So a principal of a college can be seen as what? As a gatekeeper. Okay. The other common challenge is sampling bias. Sampling bias is a concern in all research, but it takes different forms in qualitative work. So in order to address this particular challenge, you have to consider maximum variation sampling, because that is what can deliberately include diverse perspectives. And it can also establish explicit criteria that can ensure that you are not just selecting participants who are convenient or who share your viewpoints. So you have to be honest with yourself about whether you are avoiding certain types of participants because they might challenge your assumptions. It's very important. The other issue is the issue of attrition. Attrition basically involves participants dropping out during your study. It can be easily problematic, especially when you are looking at the longitudinal qualitative research, which is taking a very long time. Okay. Okay. Then resource constraints is also a reality for us as researchers, because when time is limited, focus sampling with clear boundaries will become very, very, very essential. So instead of trying to cover too much ground, you may just define a narrow scope that you can explore. You can explore it in depth with the resources you have. And then finally, many researchers struggle with saturation uncertainty. And the issue is, how do you know when you have truly reached saturation? If you don't understand this concept very well, you will have a problem. So you need to have an explicit criteria for saturation, and that will help you. It will help you decide in advance what can signal your saturation for your particular study. Then, as we are now concluding, our qualitative sampling, I want us to discuss how to evaluate the quality of our sampling decisions. First and foremost, I want us to look for the issue of alignment with the research questions and methodology. Strong sampling will demonstrate clear connections between who was studied, what the research aimed to discover. For example, if a study is claiming to examine the experience of first-generation university students, but primarily samples graduate students, there's a misalignment, because you are looking at what? Experiences of first-generation undergraduate students. So you cannot go and be looking at a graduate student sample. There will be a misalignment. So your sampling should logically flow from the research questions and methodological approach. The other thing I want us to look at is information richness of selected cases. The information richness of selected cases is one of the most important quality criteria. So you have to ask yourself, did the researcher select participants who could provide deep, detailed information about the phenomena of interest? In qualitative research basically thrives on rich data. So participants must have relevant experiences and have the ability to do what? To articulate them meaningfully. Then also the transparency of the selection process. That one too is non-negotiable in qualitative research. Because as a reader, you should be able to understand exactly how the researcher identified the participants, how were they recruited, how were they selected. So you cannot have vague statements like participants were purposely selected. When you do this, you must provide further details, because if you don't do that, there will be red flags. So you need to look for clear descriptions of your criteria and the processes. Then you also have to consider the appropriateness for intended knowledge claims. You see, different sampling approaches support different types of claims. If a study is using convenience sampling, one can make broad claims about transferability, and that's problematic. In the opposite direction, a maximum variation sampling can reasonably support claims about patterns that cut across different diverse cases. And then finally, reflexivity. I have been emphasizing on this. Reflexivity, your role. Researchers should be able to reflect on whose voices were, were missing, how the sampling decisions might have shaped their findings, and how their own background actually played a role. So as we wrap up today, the key takeaways are that when we are dealing with qualitative sampling, we should always remember that it is purposeful and not random. And then also, our strategy should align with our research. Our sampling strategy should align with the research question and the methodological approach. When we are also determining sample sizes, we must know that the sample size in qualitative research is determined by saturation and not statistical formulas. Then also, quality depends on information richness and not representativeness. And then last but not the least, transparency in documenting your sampling decisions, your sampling approaches is very, very essential. Thank you.